Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LTA North Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video for 2025. I'm very excited to get into this. The LTA has been a very hot topic over the past month or so with FlyQuest performance at MSI and just generally how people have been feeling about North America. I think a lot of people are starting to get a little bit more excited about what this region could offer and about the talent level at the top of the region, which obviously I've been kind of a proponent of on this channel. I do believe that right now the LTA is in a prime position to firmly take that number 3 region in the world slot. We'll see if these teams can live up to that, because there were some roster changes, there were some things to go over, and I'm excited to go over all of it. Of course, if you are new here, if you're new to the channel, what this video is going to be, I'm going to be going over all 8 teams in the LTA North, talking about the advantages, disadvantages, the pluses, the minuses, the changes, all of the things you need to know about those teams. I'll be power ranking all of them from number 8 to number 1 in my personal power rankings. I will be doing the same for every single player within their role as well. So number 1 to number 8 for each particular role. We'll be talking about ceilings, floors, all of that good stuff. If you've watched my videos on the LPL, the NACL, or the LCK that have already come out for this, then you'll know how this format ends up going. Of course, you'll also know if you've watched these videos in the past. I've been doing these for years on the channel. So if you're excited, let me know down in the comments section below. But a couple of caveats to start off. I always have to throw these out at the start of these videos because, you know, people are gonna leave some comments and I want to make sure I get ahead of those. First and foremost, the biggest one, as always, this is just my opinion. We are going to disagree on a lot of things, you know, at least some things in this video here. You're gonna look at some player rankings or a team ranking and say, it's ridiculous that you have this player here. That's perfectly fine. I have no qualms with, you know, people disagreeing with me down in the comment section below. I know my opinions, especially on North America right now, are not the most universal of everybody, you know, involved in the community. And so I'm curious to know where exactly you guys think I'm too high or too low on specific players, on specific teams, all of that stuff. And let me know that down in the comment section below. I always encourage you guys to let me know where you disagree with me down there. Of course, alongside that, I do want to specify this is a very flexible scale. There are a lot of players that are very close in terms of skill level, and so when you look at a player ranked maybe number 4 or number 5 in their position, and you're like, well, they're clearly closer to number 7, or I believe they're closer to number 3, or something like that, we're probably not all that off. It's probably not all that different from my personal opinion. This is a very flexible scale in the fact that you could probably move a player up 1 or 2 spots in their own role, a team up 1 or 2 spots in terms of where they're at, and I certainly wouldn't have any major objections in that regard. So I wouldn't get too caught up in the semantics of the situation. Rather, if you think the way that I'm talking about a player or a team in terms of the overview and analysis that I'm giving in this video doesn't match up with your opinion, I would love to know that down in the comment section below. But the numbers, everything on the screen, it's more so there for, you know, just clarity, visual clarity in terms of helping expand on the points that I'm talking about. But those are the big caveats out of the way that I basically always have to start the video with. I think we do need to touch on the format, at least a little bit here for the LTA North, because it's not the same format as it's ever been. This is notoriously the pick and play format. Whether you guys like it or not, it is going to be the pick and play, I guess, regular season, if you will. The first 3 weeks of the quote-unquote regular season, it will be, you know, teams picking their own opponents, picking the matchups that they want to get themselves into. It's going to start with the lowest teams, and they just have to pick a team with a better record than themselves. I believe that means you can't pick somebody who has the same record as you, but let's say, I don't know, like we'll get to my number 8 team in just a second. Let's say they end up losing in week number 1. They can choose anybody, I believe, outside of the other teams that lost in week number 1 to face in week number 2. So theoretically, there's an opportunity for lower tier teams to have better matchups against each other to get themselves into playoffs or something like that. But for the most part, like if you're a bad team, it's going to be pretty difficult for you to consistently get matchups that you're looking for, because as far as I'm aware, it does say better record, at least on Ligapedia, and that to me signals not the same. So I don't know, we'll see the semantics of the format end up playing out as we continue to watch more, but what you really need to know is that the first 3 weeks of the regular season are pick and play, and they will be best of 3. At that point, they will be separated into the top 4 teams and the bottom 4 teams. Top 4 teams will start in upper bracket in a pseudo playoff. Bottom 4 teams will start in lower bracket in a pseudo playoff that eventually goes to qualified teams for the big America's qualifier for Worlds. And so really, this is all just set up, you know, even the first 3 weeks are just qualifying stages for where exactly you're going to be starting off your journey in the playoffs. We've seen teams go on lower bracket runs. We've seen, you know, teams be able to steamroll their way through the upper bracket as well. So, you know, really a lot to play through, and the first couple weeks are just going to be more of the feeling out process, especially for a couple of these new rosters. But it was definitely worth going over the format at least a little bit before we jumped in to our first team. But that's kind of the preamble out of the way. More things will be talked about once we throw some graphics up on the screen, but those are definitely the main ones. So without further ado, let's finally get into the main section of this video, which is the breakdowns, the team breakdowns. Of course, if you are familiar, we're going to be going worst to first in terms of these projections in my power rankings, talking about where I think these teams are going to land. And that means kicking off with number 8, which for me right now is going to be Disguised. I really just can't go any other way for the bottom of the table here in the LTA at the moment. Even with some of the changes that this team is making going into the summer split, I still have a ton of concerns with whether or not they're going to be enough to be relevant in Tier 1. I think that there is upside with this team, as there has been all year long, but I really struggle to find a reason to believe that it's just going to happen, especially with this new format. And, you know, with all these NACL teams that are really now breathing down DSG's neck in terms of trying to get that guest spot going into 2026. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Castle in the top lane, XU in the jungle, Darkwings in the mid lane, Rahel at AD carry, and Huhi at support. First and foremost, let's talk about what you are seeing on your screen here. Quickly, we'll go over kind of the visual format that you're getting. Of course, team name in the top left, as per usual. The number that is next to the team, in this case the number 8, is going to be where I personally power rank them, from number 1 to number 8 in parentheses. That will be how they have changed from last primer to now. Not the end of last split, but rather the beginning of last split. My spring split primer, I think that's a more accurate way to kind of digest whether or not I think a team got better or worse going into summer, because most of these teams wouldn't have moved much from the end of spring to summer. That was the last time we got to see them play. So Disguised went from number 7 to number 8, so they go -1. It shows how they finished in playoffs last split. Disguised was one of 2 teams in the LTA to not make playoffs, and so they get the DNQ there. Obviously, if you did make playoffs, you will have your playoff finish shown in that particular spot. You can see the starting lineup. Any asterisk next to any player name will just denote that they are taking up an import slot. That is relevant here in North America because obviously import spots are pretty important in terms of how these teams are constructed. You can see where I rank each player in their own position. Below that, outside of the parentheses, in Castle's case, I believe he's the number 7 top laner, XU's case, the number 8 jungler, etc. And then in parentheses, how that has changed as well from the spring primer to now. If it's a new player, you'll see new underneath the number grade, but the number grade still will be in relation to the player that they are replacing. Rahel is a good example of that. He's my number 4 AD carry right now in North America, and that gets a +4 from where I had Scary Jerry in my primer going into the spring split. I think that that is the fairest way to kind of judge whether or not the team got better. So those are the main things that you need to know about what you're seeing on the screen, but let's go ahead and talk about Disguised in particular. Obviously, returning 3 of 5 members from last split, I believe they're the team to make the most amount of changes heading into summer, which makes the most sense. This team has the most on the line in terms of being a bottom tier team. They still have to play for their, spot here in North America in Tier 1 going into the end of the year, regardless of if they're, 8th or if they're, 1st. It doesn't really matter. They're going to have to make sure they're in a spot to retain their Tier 1 status. And, honestly, I'm not quite sure that that's going to happen. I think the core of this team is interesting. I think you have pieces you can build around, but there are some major question marks for me. Let's start with the top side of the map with Castle here. This was a player that looked awesome in winter. It really felt like he was a great signing for DSG. Obviously a guy who came over from KT Rolster's system. There have been a lot of top laners to come out of that system and succeed, not only, domestically in the LCK, but internationally as well. And we thought Castle could theoretically be another one. Him and Perfect shared a lot of time. Obviously KT's starting top laner now down in the Challengers League, but, Castle really struggled out of the gate. I think a lot of us put that on Immortals as an organization rather than on Castle as a player, and it looked like that was going to be correct at the beginning of the year, but spring, like the entire wheel, like the wheels fell off of Castle. Let's just be entirely honest. He was horrible in the spring split. He was really terrible across that entire format and was one of the biggest reasons why Disguised was just not playable at any point really in the spring split. And for me, I'm worried that that's just kind of the reality of the situation. I'm going to say this a lot throughout this video, especially for teams that are in the bottom 3 in particular, but we've seen a trend of players with a lot of potential, but not necessarily the best current ability going to these bad organizations in North America and never developing, and in fact, getting worse over the course of time. I kind of have a feeling that's just going to happen with Castle. I hope that's not the case. I hope he can start to realize some of that mechanical upside that he has as a player, because he is aggressive and he can carry games, but man, it's just looked worse and worse basically every single time that we've seen him across 2025. And this is a trend for a lot of players that do have a lot of upside, but aren't in a good situation to get the most out of themselves as a player, is they just do get worse. And so he's going to drop down 3 spots. He's my number 7 top laner. Strong argument that he should be number 8, especially in terms of the performance he gave in the the spring split, but I do want to say that at least at the tier 1 level, we have actually seen him succeed before. We have seen him have good games and have good stats and be able to perform well. If he's going to be able to tap in more to the winter version of himself, as small of a sample size as that was, or even like the early part of the Immortal stint, I think there is something there to unlock. The problem is I just worry about how consistent you're going to be able to get that out of him, but you know, he's one of the upside pieces on this team, and I'm already talking about him as one of the weaker players in his role from last split. You have XU in the jungle. You know, I like XU as a player. I think this is a really bad spot for his playstyle in particular. You know, I've said it a lot across this year, but XU is a player that benefits a lot from having pushing lanes because he does want to play aggressive in the mid game, and for Disguise this year, he's just had some of the worst solo laners in the league. Like Castle obviously, you know, fell off a cliff in the spring split, and, you know, Abadaga was horrible, probably the worst player in North America across the entire beginning of this year, and so it's been difficult for XU to actually play the game that he feels comfortable playing, and honestly, he's just kind of been behind. He's been the worst jungler in tier 1 so far this year, but again, I think part of that is just circumstance. I think there is a world where XU can be a productive player. I don't know if he has ridiculous upside. I think right now we're just kind of seeing, you know, XU can be a player that can be valuable to a tier 1 team, maybe especially to, like, you know, a team around like a Shopify Rebellion range. You can imagine XU, you know, fitting well on a team that wants to play aggressive like that, but I don't know if he's ever going to be an elevator in terms of the talent around him. I don't know if he's ever going to be the kind of player you want as a top 2 player on your team, and that does concern me because Disguised is really struggling for top tier talent right now, and so we'll see what XU can do. I was a bit surprised that they brought him back, to be entirely frank, not because I think he doesn't deserve another shot. In fact, I think more players deserve more time to develop at the tier 1 level, like Scary Jerry and Surdy, who we'll talk about in a second, but rather because with so much on the line, I'm not sure if XU is the kind of player that is really going to guarantee your spot back in tier 1 going into next year. And then the final player they're returning is Huhi down in the support position. I still really like Huhi. I think he was better in the spring split. I think the bot lane in general was better. He's not been very good across 2025, but obviously this is a guy who's formerly been one of the best supports in North America for an extended period of time for both 100 Thieves and Golden Guardians back in the day. Things didn't necessarily work out for him last year, and they're not working out for him right now either. Maybe he just is on the downturn, but I think a lot of that just ends up being circumstance, and theoretically with a higher floor AD carry coming in, maybe you get to see a better version of Huki that's a lot closer to what he was in 2022, 2023, that version of him that really started to separate himself as one of, you know, NA's best supports ever, quite frankly, in terms of what that stretch was looking like. But you are bringing in 2 new players. Let's start with Rahel, because he is going to be the highest graded player on this team. He's coming over from Europe, at least that was his last stop. This is formerly, obviously, the AD carry for SK Gaming, as well as formerly the AD carry for DK Challengers, for D plus Kia Challengers over in the LCK Challengers League. I've always been super high on Rahel. I've actually kind of been called a Rahel Glazer in the past. I remember going in, I believe to this year, at the start of 2025, I called Rahel the best AD carry in Europe from a pure mechanics perspective. And honestly, I still don't think I was all that wrong on that front. I think SK is a complete disaster. I think there's a ton going wrong with that team, which anybody who's watched them will know. But Rahel has a lot going for him. This guy, mechanically speaking, is ridiculously good. Like, he has the potential to really just dominate in kind of a similar way to what Berserker was in for Cloud9 for many years. I don't think he has the well-rounded skill set that Berserker has. I think it requires a little bit more, you know, prodding and a little bit more resource-heavy gameplay to get Rahel to be that kind of player. But we saw with SK Gaming last year, like at the end of 2024, you give him every resource that you have, you try to invest as much as possible into him, he can, like, carry a team. He can absolutely drag a team across the finish line. SK Gaming was top 6 in the LEC last year. People forget that, and it was almost entirely due to the bot lane. Now, there have been questions about whether or not Rahel is a little bit, you know, meta dependent. I think that is a fair thing to say about his champion pool. He is also a player that has struggled in best of 5s historically, which is really not a great place to sit in terms of, you know, coming in to be the elevator of the rest of the team. But from a mechanical perspective, I can't put him lower than number 4. I think there is a big 3 in terms of AD carries right now in the LTA, and I think Rahel, you know, needs to prove that he can broach that top 3. I do think he's a tier down from that, but I think he, out of everyone left, like, he's probably the best player just from a raw mechanics perspective. I would imagine that carries over. Maybe you don't get the same kind of performance that you got in Europe, but I think it's likely that he's better than he was at the beginning of the year here for DSG. I think he's playing with a better support in Huhi. I think you could argue his surrounding cast here is better than what SK Gaming had. In fact, I would make that argument, regardless of how bad Disguised has been domestically. I think this is better than SK Gaming, and so, you know, I can imagine a world where Rahel can come out and actually just carry this team to around top 6 or somewhere in that vein, but but he is the big upside piece here. And then you're also bringing Darkwings into the mid lane. This is a very interesting addition from my perspective because I just didn't really see it coming, to be entirely honest. There were a lot of links to other players in the mid lane role here, specifically Toasty was getting a lot of, attention in terms of, oh, he's probably going to be the next mid laner for Disguised. And Toasty's a player, obviously, I've gone on and on about in terms of the upside that he offers as a mid laner. Darkwings has been in the system a very long time. He's really been killing tier 3, and he's been pretty good at the tier 2 level for a little while, whether it be for Dignitas, whether it be, for multiple organizations. We most recently saw him on Conviction in the spring split, where he, was really great and honestly was a big piece on why that team ended up top 3 and one game away from going to the finals of the NACL. You could argue that, at least in the regular season, he was maybe the most valuable player of that team. But the scouting report on Darkwings is a little bit deeper than that, just in terms of the way that he plays the game. Very aggressive mid laner. He is somebody who is not going to be scared to try and push up and to try and make plays in the mid game, especially. He doesn't necessarily do it on crazy aggressive picks, though. He's not, the kind of player who's going to be picking Yone and Akali every game, although he can. He definitely is good at those champions. You think of Syndra when you think of Darkwings. You think of Orianna. Like these types of, bursty control mages, I think that's where he really thrives, but he does so in a way where he wants to be the primary carry, and I certainly don't fault him for that. It just leads to an inherently more inconsistent playstyle. That was something that we always talked about with Darkwings before 2025 when, we were covering tier 2. Is just one week you can look at Darkwings and be like, man, this guy was the best player in the NACL this week. And the next week you can look at him and be like, man, that was a really bad game. He went 0-7 and just didn't do anything. And that kind of volatile playstyle is, potentially advantageous for a team like Disguise that's really looking for someone to play through, but it could also be something that really flames out. Right now I have a hard time believing that his floor is higher than a lot of the other players here, and so the floor for me comes in at number 8. That's why he comes in at number 8 in terms of the mid lane rankings, but he's certainly going to be better than Abadaga, who is an absolute disaster. Basically anybody coming into this role would be better than Abadaga, and Darkwings has shown that, that progression has maybe, it's taken some time, but it's kind of come along. Like, he was great at the beginning of this year, and I think he was more consistent at the beginning of this year. If you're getting that version of him, the Conviction version of Darkwings, I think you could actually be looking at a pretty scary team, especially if Rahel is good enough to be able to carry. There is a world where top lane, mid lane, and bot lane are all strengths for DSG in comparison to the bottom tier teams in the LTA. But I think there's also a world where Castle's not very good in the same way that he was in spring, where Darkwings really struggles to make an impact because you had prospects like Surdy and Scary Jerry coming into the LTA who were definitely better in tier 2 that didn't quite have good impacts at all, that were the weakest players in their role by a pretty considerable margin. Like, there is a real, shot that Darkwings, of all players, is not going to be able to completely break that open, especially with XU not performing great in the jungle right now. And also where Rahel is just not the player he was for SK, that he's kind of, he was a one-split wonder, which I think is a fair thing to be worried about when it comes to Disguise. So the floor on this team is absolutely nothing. Like, there is a chance that they are worse than, 4 or 5 teams in the NACL right now. There's also a chance that they could be better than, number 7 or number 6 in terms of the power rankings. I think the range of outcomes here is pretty wide because of the roster changes, but at least they're going for it right now. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this is going to be the first team that actually made playoffs last split. I'm not quite sure they're in the same spot in a top 6 perspective. It's Dignitas coming in at number 7 for me. I just have real concerns about what this team's upside looks like. I think they made a change that, while it increases their floor and theoretically increases their ceiling if everything were to click, there's just so much bad mojo surrounding this organization right now that it's hard for me to rank them in the top 6, even if that's where they finished in the last split. They kind of shockingly got there in the first place. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Photon in the top lane, Shaden in the jungle, Kana in the mid lane, Tomo at AD carry, and Isles at support. Of course, new top laner. We'll talk about him first. We'll go with the Photon story here in the conversation. Dignitas, as I'm recording this, put out a video with Surdy talking about his departure yesterday. The vibes on the team seem absolutely horrendous. I respect Dig for putting it out. I also question why they would put that out in the middle of the year. That seems like an end of the year kind of conversation to have, where they're just like, vibes were horrendous, but you're returning 4 of 5 members here and talking about how bad the vibes on the team are. It feels very strange. But if we're just talking about Photon coming in, I love Photon. I've been a huge Photon defender over the course of this channel's history. I've been somebody who's really gone to bat for him as a potential number 1 option in the West, somebody you can really carry through, kind of similar to Rahel. Both him and Rahel have been former MVP picks for me in the LEC. Rahel in 2024 summer, where I thought he was excellent for SK Gaming, and then Photon in, I believe, 2023 winter. I want to say that was the split I gave him my MVP award for, his first split on Team Vitality. This guy is awesome. Like, mechanically speaking, again, very, very talented. I know some Dignitas fans are going to get quite concerned because, oh, it's another import, especially in the top lane, and this has just not worked out for this organization, kind of, because you've had players like Armut coming in, you've had players like Rich coming in, but I want to try and dissuade the fears a little bit. Photon is not the same player as those two are. Armut was the 5th best player on a team that went to Worlds, was weak side, was never really asked to be a carry, and so when you brought him in and asked him to play like a pivotal role in North America with, you know, a bunch of players he's never played with before, he just wasn't capable of doing that. It wasn't really surprising to see him struggle so much in NA, I'll be entirely honest. Now for Rich, he's a player that I think performed fine in North America. He fit the style of the league, but once again, a player that historically speaking had been, let's ignore him on the top side, let's let him lose in lane and then, you know, go and play team fights relatively well. That had been his MO throughout his entire career with, you know, Nongshim going over to, you know, obviously Ninjas in Pajamas and that Victory 5 organization over in the LPL. Like, he had never been a player that had ever found any success individually, and so you weren't expecting a ton out of him. Even someone like Dove coming over last year, everyone looked at as like, why are you doing this? Like, this is not a star player. Photon is better than all of those players. I can basically promise that. You know, Photon has a ton of upside as a top laner. Do I think he's guaranteed to unlock it? No, I certainly don't. I think he has gotten a little bit worse over time in the LEC, which is never a good trajectory arc, but I also don't think he's gotten worse by like a large margin. I more so just think that, you know, obviously a lot of the Vitality problems had started to catch up to Photon. He spent the beginning part of this year, you know, playing in Turkey. And I'll be honest, the tape wasn't ridiculously encouraging. It felt like he was a bit mentally disconnected. If you're getting a version of Photon that's locked in, like, this guy was a T1 Academy top laner for a reason. Like, he was coming out of that T1 system, and everybody who's come out of that system seems to have found success basically everywhere, unless you're a mid laner, shout out. But Photon's a player that I really do believe could add upside to this team more so than some of the other imports that Dig has gone after that I've lambasted over the course of this year. Don't forget, like, it's not like I've defended imports on this team in the past, but I think Photon is a little bit different. So at least for now, I'm going to rank him as a top 3 top laner in North America. I think top lane's a pretty weak role, and I think Photon has the potential to really break through. But the rest of this team, I still do have concerns about. Shaden is the player I'm the highest on, that is retained on Dignitas here. I think Shaden shows a lot of really great traits for a tier 1 team. I think he can be a facilitator. I think he can be a carry as well. He's an aggressive player who's not afraid to try to look for mid-game skirmishes, but he understands that he can't always get away with that. You know, I was a bit concerned about Shaden coming up as a prospect because at least in tier 2, he would have incredible games and he would have terrible games. Like, the volatility of Shaden was ginormous. That's not really been the case here for Dig. There are some bad games, but most of it I can attribute to the fact that his laners have been quite bad, and it's difficult to play jungle in a league where your laners are just some of the worst in the league. So for Shaden, I feel pretty good, and I think him and Photon as a top jungle duo could actually be really scary if they do want to invest a lot into the top side of the map. And I also think there's something there with Kena in the mid lane. I think you can play around him. I don't think he's a star, but I think he's a good player. I just think that there are a lot of mid laners that have really come up and really kind of established themselves as being pretty darn good at this level, and Kena, you know, in response has fallen in terms of being one of the weaker mid laners, but he's not a complete pushover. This is a guy who would dominate Latin America, as he has obviously in the past, and he's even been able to dominate North American players at international tournaments before. I mean, you go look at last year's Worlds. Like, we've seen it with Kena, and at the beginning of the year, it looked like it was going to be the case, but again, with the emergence of a lot of the imports really getting better over the course of last split, players like Saint and Loki really establishing themselves, it's clear that Kena's just not quite on the same level of player as those other guys are. I do think there's something in here. You know, not all positions are created equally. You know, everybody knows that. Mid lane's just one of the better positions here in North America, at least from a depth perspective right now, and, you know, I think Kena would generally be fine. It's just difficult for me to project that he's going to be a difference maker here. I think if Shaden can continue to grow, and if he can be like a top 4 jungler, which I think is, you know, possible. I'm not going to say it's realistic, but it's possible that he ends up being like a top 4 jungler here. I think Kena could have an easier time being able to push forward and play aggressive in the mid game, which I think would help him a lot. And if this top side's good, I don't know, maybe Dig is better than I'm giving them credit for, but that's the upside part of this team. You know, Tomo and Isles, I really had high expectations for them going into the year. I really wanted to sit here and be like, oh, Tomo and Isles, last time these two were a duo in 2024, they were one of the better laning duos in the entire league. It was really just LYON and Core JJ that were better than them in the 2v2. Obviously, they would completely fall off a cliff in team fights, and that's why they weren't considered one of the best bot lanes in the league or anything like that, but Like, in terms of dominating and getting early gold leads, Tomo's really good at that. That's kind of his whole thing as an AD carry. I think Isles is a very good 2v2 player, and so I was hopeful that they were going to, at the very least, be able to do that in transition into, like, Shaden and Surdy being able to carry on the top side of the map. It's not happened at all. They've just kind of been the weakest bot lane in the LTA so far this year. So, Tomo coming in at number 8 for me, early game-focused AD carry that wants to generate leads, but doesn't necessarily have the dominant mechanical talent to do it super consistently. AD carry is another very stacked and very deep role here in North America in terms of the talent that we have. Tomo is just a player I'm not expecting to really break through. I think his floor is quite low. If he doesn't get leads in the early game, he's just not a valuable player in the AD carry role. And Isles is a player that is like your stock standard, slightly below average support. He's slightly below average at everything. That can be valuable on certain teams because he's not terrible at anything. There's really no part of his game that is bad. He can succeed in most parts of the game, but he's really not someone that's ever going to elevate the rest of your roster. He's an okay laner. He's an okay team fighter. He's an okay skirmisher, but he's not really great at anything, and I think that can be a bit difficult. I would say jack of all trades, master of none, but I don't even know if I would say he's like master all the trades. I think it's more so just he's pretty good at most things, and you can kind of feel okay with that. The problem is when you have an AD carry that is so specialized and you've got a support that doesn't necessarily elevate him in either other parts of his game or really double down on the part of his game he's really good at, then you're looking at a bot lane that's just kind of not very good at anything, and that ends up being a bit of a problem. So Tomo and Isles, I'm a lot lower on. That's a big reason why Dignitas comes in at number 7. Kana, I think, is going to struggle going up against the mid lane pool that's gotten better over the course of this year, and I just don't know what Photon is going to look like in the top lane. If he comes in and is like an MVP caliber player, which I think is possible here from a mechanical perspective, then yeah, you're looking at a top 3 top laner. You're looking at a team that's closer to number 6, maybe even number 5 if everything were to go right for Dignitas, but in reality, I think they're a lot closer to being bottom 2 than they are to being in that upper echelon, and I'm expecting Photon to have good games and bad games here. I'm not expecting him to be this consistent star. I just think top lane's pretty weak in North America. So Dig, even with an addition in the top lane that I like from a win right now perspective, I dislike it from a why are you benching Surdy perspective. Give players time to grow and develop at the tier 1 level. Why are you investing into players only to give up on them? It makes no sense to me. Like, that part of it I don't like, but from a, what is this team going to be in 2025 perspective, I think Photon could add to this team. We'll just kind of have to wait and see whether or not it's enough to elevate everyone else. But then moving on now to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is a team I've been lower on than basically everybody throughout the entirety of this year. I was kind of proven right on that in the spring split. We'll see if it carries through. It's LYON coming in at number 6 for me. I still think this team has some like critical flaws that are going to keep them out of being relevant, but I understand why. There's more optimism surrounding them, and they're one of the few teams that I think just genuinely made a good decision going into this split, even if I am a little bit worried about what it means overall for the team right now, and we'll kind of talk about why. Not because I dislike the player, but more so because I'm concerned about the fit on the team. But overall, again, it's a smart decision. I love promoting from tier 2. Take the MVP and see if you can make it work. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Zamudo in the top lane, Odilan in the jungle, Saint in the mid lane, Henna at AD carry, and Lions at support. Let's start with Zamudo because people are going to get upset by this ranking, I think, pretty quickly here. He does come in as my number 8 top laner, the last ranked top laner for me. I really don't want to put him there. This is a player that obviously has shown so much growth over his time in tier 2 and has really shown himself to be a mechanical powerhouse in terms of what he can be at a top level. And again, he's gotten better, which I think is a really good sign. But I think fit-wise on LYON, I am a bit concerned about what he offers in Split 1. First and foremost, look at players that, already came up through the system. Players like Scary Jerry, players like Surdy, they were not able to find success in their first split. And I think part of that is just, playstyle expectations for a young player coming into a team where he's not going to be the main character, because he's not on this team. Saint is going to be the main character, so Zamudo's going to have to take more of a backseat. That's already something that I think is a strike against these players coming up that have really been main characters on their tier 2 team like Zamudo was, but even more so for Zamudo, really his performance was not very good in tier 2 until he got onto Dragonsteel, onto Maryville, and started being someone that got really enabled by the jungler. And I'm not saying that that is something I'm super concerned about, because Zamudo I think is versatile enough to be able to survive, but when I think of Zamudo and when I think of a situation that would really fit him, he is a very resource heavy top laner. He is somebody who wants to play strong side most games. He wants to be able to really push push up in lane and really be able to carry in the mid game and obviously carry in late game team fights, and he's more than talented enough to do so. I just don't think that that's going to be what LYON ends up doing with him. That's not what Dignitas did with Surdy, and I think it's even worse here. I think there's more talent on LYON in terms of like the mid laner that you want to play for and the bot laner that you want to play for than Dignitas had with players like Kana and Tomo. I think Zamudo's going to need get even less resources, and quite frankly, I'm not super sold on the idea that Zamudo day one can be a good weak side top laner in tier 1. I just am a little concerned about that fit in general. Again, going alongside the fact that, Surdy and, Scary Jerry, they also struggled at this level, and, maybe this is an unpopular take. I think those players were better prospects than Zamudo was, especially in terms of like, lack of flaws. I think Jerry had his own set of, problems, but I think Surdy, like as a straight one-to-one comparison, was a better top lane prospect than Zamudo was, and Surdy struggled way more in a situation that was probably a bit better overall for him. Maybe the coaching staff wasn't doing everything they could, but in terms of player construction, like I think it was better to highlight Surdy on Dig than it is for Zamudo to highlight on LYON, and that makes me concerned about what he's going to be this split, and it makes me concerned that if he struggles, like what's going to be the case going into 2026. I hope for his sake he actually is able to be a main character, he's able to show off a lot of the good traits that he has, but again, my worry here is that he's going to become a bit more of a weak side top laner, that ODLAN and LYONs are going to be playing for Saint and Henna, the two imports that they were already playing for, and that Zamudo's just going to be one of the weaker weak side top laners in the league. Again, I hope it's not the case, but the floor is pretty low there. When you're looking at the upside for Zamudo, he has the talent to be one of the best top laners in North America, very similar to Surdy. In fact, you could argue that mechanically speaking, he's just as good, if not better, than Surdy is from a mechanics perspective. I don't think his game is nearly as well-rounded. I think he can still struggle when he has to play from behind, but he never got behind in Tier 2. He was constantly winning. So again, I hope he's able to carry that form through. He was the MVP, even though he missed a couple of games with Dark Zero kind of swapping out their roster mid-split, and that really just goes to show how effective he is. I'm excited for Zamudo, but I am a bit concerned, at least in terms of what he will be in 2025. Rest of this team, though, we know what they are. ODLAN and LYONs, I think we can pair together. They are weaker mechanically speaking. They don't necessarily have the ability to keep up with a lot of the top tier players in North America, which we've seen, but they're generally solid enough. ODLAN in particular has had good moments throughout a lot of this year. I think he was better in spring than he was in winter, which is an encouraging sign. I think for the most part, that's because he started to play for Saint a lot more. They really just started to pump resources into the mid lane here, and I think that is generally a good thing overall for LYON, but ODLAN's not going to set the world on fire. LYONs is probably the weakest support in the entire league. Really has not impressed me at all. He's barely made any sort of like substantial impact. He's not necessarily been terrible, but the 2v2 stats are not good for Henna and LYONs, and also he's not really a big playmaker in team fights, so just kind of a below average player, not really much to say there. Really, the big carries on this team are the two imports, and really, it's Saint in the mid lane. Like, he is the main character of LYON. That's why I am constantly talking about this team putting resources into the mid lane, because everywhere Saint has gone, he's been receiving resources. He's been a main character in terms of how he plays the game, and it kind of worked for LYON, but Saint inherently is a very inconsistent player, and I don't think a lot of people agree with me on that, but I don't really know what else there is to see when you watch him. His good games are incredible. He had multiple Player of the Week nominations in terms of what he was over the course of Spring Split, but there were also some weeks where it's like, oh, you're the dud of the week in the LTA. Like, you just were not able to get going, you had to play from behind, and you weren't particularly useful. He doesn't really know when to take his foot off the gas, and I think oftentimes that can be a big problem for a team that doesn't really have the talent to consistently win elsewhere, and to put him in a position where he can fight all the time. He kind of has to be a lot more patient in terms of where he picks his battles, and I just don't think that part of his game is there right now. I saw that in the Challengers League, and that was a reason I was a little bit lower on Saint as a player coming into North America. The talent is there. Like, we know this guy is crazy good, and when he wins on his own in the 1v1 in the mid lane, like, he can do a lot with those resources even when the rest of the map is losing, but I think the consistency is something that needs to improve, and that's why he still comes outside my top 4 in terms of mid lane rankings. I don't know how popular that take is going to be. I think a lot of people are going to have Saint, above a couple of players that I have in the top 4, like APA and like Loki, that I think are a little bit better right now than Saint, but the inconsistency really does bother me, and to me, that means he pretty clearly comes in at number 5 in the rankings, even if he is going to be the one still receiving a lot of the resources on this team. And then there's Henna. Henna's fine. Like, I'm going to say something that people aren't going to like. This guy's just B-Boy. Like, there's, like, almost no difference in terms of how they play the game. Both of them can succeed if the rest of the team is doing well. Henna's a better laner. I'll give him that. Like, I think B-Boy's a better team fighter, but Henna's a pretty decent 2v2 player. I think he can generate his own leads, and he can stay relevant throughout the game, but he's another player that just doesn't really pop off the page. He's not going to carry a team. You don't want him to be the number 1 option. He certainly wasn't that in the LCK. Obviously, he's better here in the LTA than he was in the LCK, LCK with the talent level being a little worse, but I don't think he's a top 4 or top 5 AD carry. Like, do I think he's what Rahel is for Disguise? No, I think Rahel is a significantly more mechanically talented player than someone like Henna is, who's just kind of been below average everywhere he's gone, every region he's played in, whether it's the LCK, the LPL, or now here in the LTA. So overall, when you're looking at LYON, I do think that there are a lot of concerns, but the talent level on this team is just higher than Dignitas or Disguised or the teams we've talked about before this. Because if everything does click, if you're playing around Saint and Henna and they're able to be, you know, 1A, 1B in terms of the carry potential, and Zamudo is able to get resources on the top side, it doesn't really matter what's happening jungle and support. Even if I think they're a bit weaker, this team is still going to thrive. And so there is a world where everything clicks for LYON. I'm just a little bit worried about the too many cooks argument here. I'm worried that Zamudo's going to have to play weak side and struggle to be able to adapt to that in tier 1 basically immediately, and that Saint is just not the kind of guy that you want to hitch your wagon to try to be a top 4 team. That's my concern with LYON right now. Again, maybe they prove me wrong, but I've been lower on them all year, and unfortunately so far, it's just kind of aged well. But then moving on now to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is a tier jump up. I do think there is a bottom 3 right now in terms of floor in the LTA, and we kind of went over those 3 teams, but 5 upwards I think actually have upside to be potentially like top 3 in terms of how things break down if everything were to work, and that is highlighted by the fact that my number 5 team is Shopify Rebellion, who's coming off of a 3rd place finish in the playoffs across the spring split. Of course, they were kind of the miracle run of the playoffs after being kind of a disaster for most of the year up until that point. This was one of those, you know, good but not great super teams that just never really ended up working in terms of the players coming together. You know, I think that that's a fair way to categorize it. You got a bunch of, you know, middle tier players together, and it's for some reason those teams just never end up working out. It's crazy, but Shopify I think have some things going for them that if they're able to unlock themselves a bit more consistently, yeah, I mean they were top 3 last split for a reason. They beat a bunch of teams that were supposed to be better than them. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Fudge in the top lane, Contracts in the jungle, Palafox in the mid lane, B-Boy at AD carry, and Seos at support. Really what it comes down to with Shopify, and you know, it's a pretty simple equation, is that playoff form legit? Like, is that who they are? Is that going to be what they're going to be moving forward? Because, you know, they end up replacing their coach, Demonte ends up coming in, the vibes seem to completely reset on Shopify, and everybody really starts playing up to their best form again. And if that happens, Shopify is not going to be 5th. They're likely going to be, you know, probably 4th in terms of these rankings, but they could finish even better than that with Team Liquid having some struggles down the stretch of the split. You know, Shopify is one of those teams that's going to be really interesting to watch, in my opinion, in terms of the early part of the split. Which version of them is real? I think the 2 players you have to talk about first in that equation, we'll get to Contracts because he's the best player on this team, but I'm not as worried about Contracts. Contracts was generally just fine throughout a lot of the years so far, even when the team started to get better. Mostly it was just him playing at the same level and everybody else actually catching up. But really, the 2 players who turned around their form in the playoffs were Fudge and Palafox, who I thought both were excellent. Palafox was incredible in the playoff run, genuinely one of the best players in the playoffs in the LTA, and that's coming off of a split where everybody was like, it's probably time for Palafox to get benched and for him to go either back down to tier 2 or for him to not necessarily be a tier 1 mid laner anymore. He comes back in the playoff run and just shows Palafaker again, like shows that peak NRG, like CLG Palafox version of himself that we know is still in there. It really does feel like he is just such a vibes-based player that he really is so streaky in terms of the way that he wants to play the game, and it's because he is so aggressive as a player. We've talked about this a bit with other players in the past, but when you are going to be this player that wants to push up and be really aggro, and especially for Palafox, who really is that Yone, Akali, Silas, like melee, you know, carry kind of player, when you're going to play that style and you're losing constantly in the 1v1, you're going to look really bad. You're going to be a pretty useless player. But if you are able to generate leads, like Palafox took over games in the playoffs, genuinely was able to just outplay Team Liquid and just kind of knock them out of the playoffs, be the best player on the Rift in that series, which was super impressive stuff. It's hard for me to rank him above number 6 in terms of my mid lane rankings because I just have no idea which version of him we're going to get. If he's playoff Palafox, like that is a top 3 or 4 mid laner in the LTA, like genuinely. That's the kind of version of him that we got. But over the course of this year, that's not necessarily been the reality of who Palafox has been. So, you know, for now, I'm going to take kind of a middle approach. He's not going to be like near the bottom like he would have been, but certainly not going to be near the top until he proves it. Same thing for Fudge, who I think, you know, I said a lot last split, did get too much hate, I think generally speaking, for his play. There were some really bad games from Fudge. I'm certainly not going to rule that out and pretend like everything was perfect, but I think the train was piling on a little bit too much for his performances. I don't think he was a bottom 2 or bottom 3 top laner really at any point throughout the split. That being said, I do think top lane got better with Photon coming in, potentially Zamudo, doing some really cool things for LYON. I think there is a chance that top lane is just going to be a bit more difficult to break through on, and that's why he still comes in at number 6 for me. If he's going to be a top 4 or top 5 top laner, I think that is another big piece for Shopify. At the very least, if he's going to be able to survive on the top side, I think that is a big deal. This is a player that has basically always done really well when he is comfortable and when he feels confident when he goes out to play. When he is starting to feel less confident, very licorice-esque in that regard, when he starts to lose that momentum and that confidence, his play can fall off a crater pretty quickly. He is very streaky in that regard, but again, the good version of him is very good. And then you have contracts, really supplements all this. I talked about it. He's the best player on this team. He comes in as my number 4 jungler in North America. I think there is a strong argument that he's number 3. I think really like number 3, number 4, I'll spoil it. River, contracts, whoever you want at number 3, I think is kind of up to you. I'm putting contracts at 4 because I do think he's a bit more volatile than River is, but honestly, contracts has been better this year than River was, and so if you want him at number 3, I think that's entirely fair. He's really, really good at most areas of the game. The only concern I really ever have with contracts is that he is such an aggressive player that you honestly don't want him on carries. You don't want him to be the kind of player that has to step up and make a lot of big decisions because he's probably going to go in a lot of those instances, and that can get him into trouble. His best games have always been on things like Ivern and Sejuani and Zac, and, honestly, like, I'm not going to say that he's as good as this player, but he kind of is budget Tarzan in terms of the way that he wants to play the game. I think it's actually a pretty apt comparison from a playstyle perspective. And when that works, it works really well here in North America because he can step up and generate leads in the mid game in the same way that Tarzan does in the LPL. So I like having contracts on this team. I think he was a reason why Palafox ended up turning around his form, why Fudge ended up turning around his form in the playoffs. But if there is a concern for Shopify, it's probably the bot lane here, and it's not really Seos, although I will say I was probably a little bit too high on Seos coming into the year. I really thought this guy was going to come into North America and like show that he could be an upper tier support from day one. Didn't really happen. Obviously, weird circumstances. He wasn't able to play in Winter Split because of visa issues. Zazel had to start here in the support position, but, he's gotten some time to adjust with Shopify, and while he's fine, he definitely seems more like a middle-of-the-pack type of support than he does like somebody who's going to break through the upper echelon. Still perfectly fine to be able to get top 4 or top 5 with if you're going to push for that. My concern really is B-Boy in the bot lane, who has consistently gotten worse so far in North America. Even during the playoff run, there were some games that he just was not playing well, and there were some games where he was excellent. I don't want to, make it seem like he was really bad in the playoff run or anything like that when they ended up overperforming. But man, there were some games where it's like, dude, you gotta stop stepping up and you have to stop dying in team fights for basically no reason. And that was something that was really prevalent for him throughout the entirety of the spring split. If that's going to be a real issue for B-Boy moving forward, I can't rank him above the number 7 AD carry in North America. And that's a pretty bad place to be. Generally speaking, again, ADC is pretty good in the region. And so having a player like B-Boy that you would hope could be like a middle tier player, somebody who's been an all-pro in North America in the past, having him fall all the way down to number 7, it's concerning. And that's on top of the fact that, you're hoping for the same kind of production from Palafox or from Fudge. I think bare minimum, if this team is like somewhere in the middle of what they were in the playoffs versus what they were in the regular season, that's a top 5 team in North America, which is why they come in at number 5 for me. But if they want to be top 3 or top 4 like they were, it's got to be Palafox and it's got to be Fudge who step up, because I trust contracts. I think Seos is going to be fine. And honestly, I'm not sold that B-Boy is going to be dominant either way. I think it really comes down to which version of the solo laners you get, whether or not the vibes are completely intact going into the entire rest of the split, and whether or not they can start off hot and start to generate that momentum. If they can do that, there is upside here, as we already saw. I just have a feeling there's going to be some natural regression, and they're probably going to start to move back down to the place we all thought they were going to be at the beginning of the year. Not quite as bad as they were in the regular season, but not quite as good as they were in the playoff run. Then moving on now to number 4 in my power rankings, the top half technically in my power rankings, and this was a team that I think everyone thought would do better in the playoffs. They just didn't. It was 100 Thieves, and the pressure's really on now for this organization because, as they have announced, this will be their final split in the LTA. They will be done as an organization after 2025, and so one last chance to potentially represent their region and go to Worlds. The odds are very much against them. It feels like a top 3 in the LTA right now in terms of just where I would expect expect it to go for the 2 spots that NA has at Worlds, but, 100 Thieves technically have, have shocked the world before. I didn't think they would get a world spot last year, and yet they ended up doing so, getting that number 3 position. They have some really good talent on this team. It's really just about putting it together. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is still looking like Sniper in the top lane, River in the jungle, Quid in the mid lane, FBI at AD carry, and Ayla at support. Still a really good team. Like, I know that people are very low on 100 Thieves because of that playoff performance, because they were, quite frankly, just straight up worse down the stretch at the end of the spring split. They end up losing, I believe, to Dignitas at the end of the regular season. That's what ends up getting Dig into playoffs and kind of kicking LYON out of playoffs. Obviously, an unfortunate turn of events for them, but 100 Thieves then go on to be one of the first 2 teams eliminated in the actual playoffs themselves, not winning a single series and dropping to Shopify Rebellion, which nobody really saw coming. Like, that was really just not an ideal set of circumstances for them, and yet everything just kind of still feels all right surrounding this team. I think that there is some optimism around what they can be. I just don't know what their ceiling actually looks like. So we can talk about the good, and really the good comes down to one player, and that's Quid in the mid lane, who still is going to come in as my number 1 mid laner in North America, because I still do believe he is the number 1 mid laner in North America. And if you want optimism for 100 Thieves, and the reason that they're still coming in above Shopify when they were clearly not better than Shopify in the playoffs and down the stretch in the regular season, it's because of Quid. I just trust him that much as a player. I think when you have somebody that can take over the game like Quid can, your floor is just a little bit higher than other teams that are kind of hoping and praying to get stuff out of their players. When you look at Palafox versus Quid, I would imagine that is a 100 Thieves favored matchup, and that's why I think going into the future, 100 Thieves just still projects like the better team, in my opinion. I think everything else you can kind of put an asterisk next to, which we will talk about, but Quid really is incredibly talented, and honestly, with this organization, not being back for 2026, as they've already announced, I really hope he stays in North America, because I think if he goes back to Korea, or perhaps goes to a different region, like the LPL or something like that, he might get caught or lost in the shuffle a little bit more. I think this is the perfect region stylistically for him to be able to take over, and I think, look at some of these top teams. They could use a player like Quid. So, I think all of the optimism surrounding 100 Thieves is Quid in the mid lane. He can do everything. He's a crazy good Azir player. The only thing he's really not all that good at is playing resourceless. He wants to be a resource-heavy player. He doesn't want to have to sit there and, play weak side like he did in his first split when he was playing with Double Lift and Closer, who were resource-heavy players. He didn't want to do that, and he wasn't very good in that role, but ever since he's kind of become the resource-heavy player on 100 Thieves, he's looked incredible for this organization. But it's everybody else on the team that does have question marks to me. We'll talk about the top side first here with Sniper. I honestly saw a lot of good things out of Sniper in the spring split. That doesn't feel like a very popular opinion, but to me, he was a top 3 top laner in the league, I think right behind Bwipo and Thanatos, in whatever order you want to put those 2 in, at least in terms of production. And I think that there were a lot of encouraging developments made by him in terms of playing without resources, because that was really the big concern. He was awesome in his rookie split in spring of 2024, and then he completely fell off a cliff in summer, was one of the big reasons why they almost didn't make Worlds in the summer split, completely sold that playoff run and was bailed out by the rest of this team being very good. And then he was horrible at Worlds, and it's like, okay, well, Sniper's just not a top-tier top laner. He was a bottom 2, bottom 3 top laner for me coming into the year, but I think he has gotten better, and I think we saw a lot of good signs out of him in this spring split if he can carry that through. Like, again, top lane's not a particularly good role in North America right now. Impact took a major step back across the beginning part of this year. We have no idea what we're going to get out of someone like Photon or Zamudo or some of these new additions to some of these other teams. Fudge is a major question mark. There's no reason Sniper can't be a top 3 top laner in North America right now, and honestly, like I said, he was in the spring split. If he can repeat that performance, I feel better about 100 Thieves. I think he is actually a pretty big turning point for this team this year. And then River in the jungle. I think I'm low on River, which doesn't really track in terms of the rankings here. I still have him at number 3 because I think the middle of jungle is also just whoever you want. Like, if you want to contracts at 3, I'm certainly not going to argue that all that much. River's just a very stable player, and you know what you're going to get out of him. I think the big reason why I'm still okay with River on this team is I do think that he does a good job of enabling Quid in particular. He's basically a second support on this team from the way that he's ended up playing over the past year or so for Quid in the mid lane, but when he's asked to do more than that, when he's asked to be a playmaker or an initiator for this team, quite frankly, he's just not very good in that role anymore. Like, I think he can be, I think that there is an opportunity potentially for teams to be able to play around him, but I've been really unimpressed by the tape when he has to do more than just be a player for Quid. Now, part of that is that Quid is not good at playing for River, and so it does make it a bit more difficult, but I don't know. I don't see like crazy upside in River. I just think the floor is really high. The definition of a high floor, low ceiling type of player at this point in his career. And then FBI and Ayla as a bot lane. They're solid. They're not what they were in winter. I think that seems like an outlier before a lot of the other bot laners really kind of got their shit together, if we're being entirely honest, before FlyQuest really figured out how they wanted to play in the 2v2. You know, Team Liquid had their ups and downs, but LYON and Core have always been great. Before Cloud9's bot lane really became one of the best in the league. You know, FBI and Ayla just have not been able to find that same kind of form from the beginning of the year. That being said, they're still fine. Ayla's still a good player. Support's not a particularly stacked position in NA, so he still comes in as a top half support. FBI ends up falling all the way down to number 5 after a pretty lackluster spring split, but, you know, this is a pretty solid number 5. If you wanted to put him above Rahel because you can expect him to perform a tad bit better than a player like Rahel, I think that that's entirely fair, and he could still be a top 4 AD carry. I think top 3 is just completely solidified, and I think Rahel has a higher mechanical ceiling than someone like FBI does, who's just a very solid all-around player at this point in his career after he's kind of really worked on being a better team fighter, but, you know, I think FBI can still have a really big impact on the game. Again, AD carry is, in my opinion, the deepest role in North America. Being number 5 here is not the same as being number 5 elsewhere. Like, you could argue FBI is a better player than Ayla. It's just, you know, not all roles are created equal. So for 100 Thieves, I still feel okay about them. Their floor is just a little bit higher to me than a team like Shopify, but honestly, I really don't see the ceiling with this team because Quid has to do so much for them. I don't really see the upside in River. I think FBI and Ayla are going to struggle to be able to break through into that top 3 bot lane kind of territory, and I think one of those things kind of has to happen. River has to be a top guy, or FBI and Ayla have to really break through, and that's alongside the fact that Sniper needs to show that whatever he was in spring is repeatable and is not going to fall off like it did last year in 2024. So there are question marks about what this team's upside can be, but from a floor perspective, I imagine they're going to be a pretty difficult team to beat for a lot of the bottom tier rosters just because of the raw talent, and so they come in top 4 for me. We'll see how that ends up aging. But that brings us to our top 3 teams, and number 3 for me, you know, is really the start of the teams that I think realistically could make Worlds. Remember, only 2 representatives at most from the LTA North. I think we're all expecting 2 at the very least, with, you know, 1 guaranteed to the LTA South, 1 to the LTA North, and the other up for grabs. But coming in just outside the top 2 for me, it's going to be Team Liquid. I think they have the most to prove, regardless of how they started off the year, and while I do really like the construction of this team, and I think that the upside is there for them to win the league once again, because I do think top 3 is kind of separated from everyone else. Obviously, after a 4th place finish and with a new jungler coming in, I just need to see it. I need to see it proven on the Rift before I really believe that this group of 5 is going to elevate to beat what top 2 has looked like so far, because the top 2 teams feel pretty strong right now in North America. So let's talk about Team Liquid here. Their lineup is looking like Impact in the top lane, UG in the jungle, APA in the mid lane, LYON at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. Let's start off with the new player that I don't have the new tag on, because technically he was already playing in the previous split, at least at the end of it. Yuji in the jungle, who's getting the full reign as the starting jungler here for Team Liquid. Definitely feels like, you know, they're going all in on him, and I love this move. Yuji is an absolute menace. In my opinion, you know, I've been covering Tier 2 in North America for quite a long time, even before I was, you know, on this channel. There were a lot of prospects that came through the Tier 2 system. Jojo Pune, Kenvi, you know, whatever big prospect, even as, you know, going back to before, like, the early days. You want to talk about, like, the big young guns that came through back in, like, 2014, 2015. I don't know if there's been a prospect that I've been more excited about than Yuji. Like, he stacks up with anybody else. Like, it's right there with Jojo Pune, in my opinion. I would put Jojo 1 and Yuji at 2 in terms of the most exciting, like, prospects to make their way to Tier 1. And honestly, for me, like, if Yuji is a bust, I'm gonna call it quits, man. Like, there's just not a lot else left to see in terms of his Tier 2 tape. This guy has dominated Tier 2 for years, even before he was getting the recognition for doing so. Even going back to 2023 and 2022, this guy was really good in that phase. So I'm so excited to see what he can do at the Tier 1 level, but I do have to be a little bit reserved in terms of the rankings right now, because at least what we've seen so far, it's been a little bit up and down for Yuji, and you can expect that. It's almost impossible for a rookie to come in and immediately be like an MVP caliber player. You're just not going to get that out of most rookies, but this team is a great example. The players on this team are a phenomenal example of what it looks like when you stick with players even after a rough start to their career. LYON is probably the best modern example of this, although there's many in North America of players who kind of struggled their rookie year, had some ups and downs, had their own sets of problems. LYON was, you know, there were calls for LYON to be benched and replaced after his rookie year, you know, coming off of that year with Summit and Piyoshik as the starting, you know, top side of the map. LYON was looked at pretty unfavorably, comes out in 2024 and becomes becomes the best AD carry in North America, as you can see him ranked here. APA was on that same team, was certainly getting calls of being a one-trick, of not, having a diverse enough champion pool and being too one-track minded in terms of his play style and being not versatile enough or whatever, right? And he grew in 2024 and is growing even more in 2025. This is what happens when you stick by young players that have a ton of potential and you have a good coaching staff that can continue to let them grow. You can turn them into some of the best players in the league, and they're hoping they can do that with Yuji. And honestly, if he's the number one jungler by the end of this split, I'm not really going to be all that surprised. Now, I maybe a little bit, because Inspired's really good and Blabber's also pretty good, but are we saying Yuji can't be what Inspired is, by the end of this year or by the end of next year? Like, that's kind of the trajectory that I think Yuji can be on. Hopefully he can start hitting that, but again, for now, I have to be a little bit conservative in these rankings because his floor is just a tad bit lower, in my opinion, than players like Contracts and River, who have been able to do it consistently at this level. But again, we already talked about the other positives. Let's get into them. APA has been awesome to start this year, and I feel so bad putting him down to number 4. I just think another player has impressed me so much across this split that APA ends up falling, but I really like APA as a player, and I think he's playing the best league of his entire career right now. Mid lane is really good at the top level right now in North America, something we have not been able to say in quite a long time, and APA is a big reason for that. He was the best player on Team Liquid in the spring split. Hopefully he can carry that through again. He got the reputation of being a one-trick, and I think part of it was understandable. The Ziggs, even the Aurelion Soul, the Nico, right? Like all of these pocket picks that he has, he does like to rely on them, but he has so many pocket picks, and he's good at the meta things now, at least good enough to be able to pass, the checks against a lot of the other mid laners here, that you have to consider him an upper tier mid laner, a B plus, kind of player that can really elevate to a world's caliber mid laner. So excited to see that development out of APA, but it's this bot lane that really elevates this team. It's why you're excited. LYON, to me, is still the best AD carry in North America. Now, was he the best ADC in NA in spring? No, I don't think he was. I think Sven was better. I think Masu was arguably better, but, in the top 3, which there is like a clear top 3 right now, I still think LYON's upside is by far the highest of those players. He is still the most lane-dominant AD carry you will ever see in your entire existence. Give this guy Smolder, give him Zeri. It doesn't matter. He's going to be up 30 CS. He's going to be up 1k gold. It's just how he operates. He's really, really good in that phase of the game, and Core JJ obviously helps with that, but LYON is really a special kind of talent. If he can just start to be a bit more consistent in the late game, he's still an absolute menace, so really cool to see that. Core JJ obviously is still very good. I think there was two other supports that really impressed me a lot, so he falls to number 3. I've been a little bit lower on Core over the past year and a half, as anybody who's followed the channel will know. I'm not trying to say that he's a bad player. Do I think he's the MVP type of Core JJ that he's been previously? No, I don't think that player is there anymore, at least from what we've seen the past year or so, but I thought he was great to start the year, and I still think he's playing better right now than he did last year, and he was really good last year too, so no qualms with the bot lane. They're the strength of Team Liquid, arguably the best bot lane in the entire league, inarguably the best bot lane in the entire league when everything goes correctly. It's just about whether or not you can get that form out of them. And then the final player to talk about here is Impact on the top side. I'm kind of buying out on Impact. I hate to keep bringing up a point that I've made a lot over the course of this year, but the trend is very real. Impact's first year on a new organization, always incredible. He ends up playing absolutely out of his mind. He's an MVP caliber player almost every single time. Going back to Team Liquid the first time when he joined them in 2018, even going back to Cloud9 when he joined them and he was an MVP caliber player, his first split there. Team Liquid in 2018, he was incredible. You have Evil Geniuses in 2020 where he was incredible. You have FlyQuest where he was really good for the one split he was there, and then coming back to Team Liquid, he was awesome in his first year back in 2024. And every year he spends on an org after the first year, he gets worse and worse on that org. I'm not sure why that trend has been so consistent for him throughout his career, but it's kind of happening right now again. Impact has been, quite frankly, a liability across this year. 5th is generous for his performances from my perspective. I think that there are a lot of games that he just insta-lost for Team Liquid by losing tempo on the top side of the map. I also think there are things that he's doing that are a bit under the radar that maybe he gets a bit too much criticism for. Maybe he's not been quite as bad in certain areas as maybe some people would like to make him out to be, but quite frankly, he's not been better than Sniper this year. He doesn't project to be better than Sniper if he plays the way that he has this year going into the summer split, and so he comes down as a number 5 top laner. He needs to be a top 2, top 3 guy, and we know he can do it. It's Impact. He's the most historic top laner in North American history, at least from my perspective, but, he just needs to show it, because so far this year, he's just not been good at all. He's actually actually just been a liability, and he's been holding this team back. So hopefully that doesn't end up continuing to be the case, but if Yuji can come in and really reignite the team, be better mechanically, and just overall have higher upside than what had, which I think he absolutely can be, if APA continues to be great, if LYON and Core can get back to their form at the beginning of the year rather than spring, like if all of the best version of Team Liquid comes out, this team can still win the LTA, and I certainly don't think that is a hot take. I certainly don't think anyone can debate that. It's just about if that's the version of them that's going to exist. At the end of the spring split, they were clearly not in the top 2, and so it's hard for me to rank them there right now. The upside is there. I need to see it on tape first. But that brings us to our top 2 teams and my projected Worlds teams right now. And honestly, this is kind of the consensus top 2. I'd love to sit here and say I'm making a statement, but we know the top 2 teams, and you probably know the order, because coming in at number 2 for me, it will be Cloud9. And I think we can all understand why this team has continued to rise in rankings throughout this year. It really feels like they are starting to click. Now, the moment that Cloud9 feels like they're starting to click going into summer, that's when everything kind of falls apart for this team, usually, at least in the past couple of years. It's very funny. Cloud9 was always the team that was like, no matter what's happening in North America, they're gonna make Worlds. They're gonna go on the big gauntlet run and figure it out and end up getting into Worlds and being the best performing team from North America at Worlds. That was like 2015, 2014, 2016, 2018, like it just felt like every year Cloud9 was going to figure it out, get to Worlds, and just like you could count on them being clutch when it mattered the most. And that's kind of been the opposite in the 2020s so far, where it feels like, oh, Cloud9 has all these hyped super teams, like they have all these big rosters, and yet they're never really able to live up to the hype. 2020, they missed Worlds, and notably in 2024, they have a super hyped roster and end up missing Worlds. You gotta hope that's not going to be the case for Cloud9 again, but with only 2 World slots at most going to the north here of LTA, you're definitely in a spot where you have to step up or step aside, because there are teams breathing down your neck. But their lineup is looking like Thanatos in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, Loki in the mid lane, Sven at AD carry, and Vulcan at support. We'll just go top to support here, because I think that obviously returning every member and just talking generally about how good this team is makes sense in that order. Starting with Thanatos in the top lane, he's coming in as my number 1 top laner in the LTA. I think it's really only fair to call him the number 1 top laner, because I think at this point, from a mechanical perspective, he's the only player in the top lane role who has that kind of upside, who can have those kinds of games where you just obliterate enemy teams, and also he doesn't really have like the horrible games. Bwipo obviously has so many great games, and he has so many moments where he's able to really assert the dominance that he has over a lot of players mechanically at this level. But he's also going to make a ton of weird mistakes for no reason, because that's just who Bwipo is. And Thanatos has those good moments, doesn't necessarily have the bad moments, which I think really kind of solidifies him as the number 1 top laner, even if Bwipo, I think, was more valuable in the spring split. So I hope that makes sense. Thanatos is really good. He's kind of blossomed into everything Cloud9 wanted him to be, everything every analyst wanted him to be coming over here to North America. Sometimes we don't see that development be super linear. Hopefully his former teammate in Saint will have similar development, but sometimes you get these super hyped prospects that come to NA and they just have holes in their game. Thanatos does not have holes in his game. He's actually developed quite a lot since coming over to NA, especially as a late game team fighter. So really cool stuff to see there. You've got Blabber in the jungle. Honestly, I'm starting to sour a little bit on Blabber. Like, I'm not going to sit here and, like, throw out that, oh, this guy's bad. He's still a top 2 jungler, I think, at absolute worst until proven otherwise in the LTA, but he's not fighting for number 1 anymore like he was for basically every year of his career from 2020 onwards, and he's certainly not as versatile as he used to be. Honestly, I kind of hate Blabber on carries. I think basically every single time this guy plays something really aggressive, it ends up going very poorly for both him and for Cloud9. I don't know if that's because the rest of the team can't play around him in that kind of way, but, the idea behind this offseason was like, okay, we're going to bring in Sven, we're going to bring in Loki. These are going to be low resource players that don't necessarily need to be, like, babysat by their jungler, because Blabber can kind of take more of an aggressive approach back rather than having to play with someone like Jojo Pune, who needed a lot of resources. But as this team found out very quickly, it's just not the playstyle Blabber excels at. Get this guy on facilitators, get him on Maokai and Sejuani and Gragas and, a lot of these other picks that he's been super successful on all the time throughout his career, and let him play for everybody else. That's where he's going to be at his best, and I think that's where he has been at his best throughout his entire career. It's just more apparent now. I think the carry games are worse, and I think the facilitator games are just as good. If he can start to really hone in, either get back to those carry performances that he had in 2020, 2021, or if he can just become like the best facilitator in the jungle position in North America, which I think is totally possible, by the way. Like, that's his avenue and his path back to being like your A+ kind of player, but he's not been that recently. I think A-, B+ is a fair place to put him, and that's probably the lowest he's been in terms of these grades in years. But if you want me to be a little bit lower on Blabber, then I'm much higher on basically everybody else on this team. Loki is coming in all the way at number 3 for me in mid lane rankings. Some people might see this as too high, but man, I rewatched that Loki tape. This guy's really good. Like, this guy has a lot of mechanical skill, and I think he's got the surrounding core to be able to get the most out of him. Again, they brought him in because he was more of a, shove and roam facilitative type of mid laner. He didn't want a ton of resources. He wanted to play a little bit more low resource in the Challengers League, but that basically completely flipped when he got here to NA. He started playing a lot more aggressive, and once Blabber started playing for him, in particular in the mid lane, Cloud9 got really, really scary. They became one of the more dangerous teams in the entire league, so really excited to see Loki kind of come into his own, and honestly, as a carry, this guy's crazy good. He plays the standard, like, Korean mid laner picks, like Azir, and, you're not worried too much about him, deviating too much off of that path. Honestly, reminds me a lot of Quid in that regard, but can play some more aggressive mid laners if you need him to. He really is just a lot better than I thought he was going to be, and he's kind of a well-rounded, very good mid laner. I feel pretty confident with him being top 3. If you wanted him number 4, I think that's fair. I don't think you can put him lower than that. Players like Saint have just not proven enough to show me that they're better or more consistent than someone like Loki. Again, if you wanted APA above him, I kind of understand that, but Loki to me was better in the spring split, so he's coming in at number 3, and I've been really excited about, being wrong on him, quite frankly. I was way too low on him in the offseason. And then you've got Sven and Vulcan, the most consistent bot lane in the league, like certainly the most consistent last split, which was really cool to see. Really happy for them, because I think a lot of people have really turned on these two players in terms of what their reputations have become over the past couple of years. But Sven is always a player that I think has been undervalued as an AD carry. I think there were moments as a support where I was just like, he's good, but he's not great. He's your B caliber support. It never really felt like he was perfect in that role. In the AD carry role, like on TSM, especially after the TSM days, the Cloud9 days around 2020, and then Dignitas last year, Cloud9 this year, this guy has never been anything other than very good as an AD carry, and I feel very good about expecting him to be the same moving forward. He's a top 2 ADC for me, and that's a very controversial take. I think a lot of people are going to put him at number 3. If you've noticed, number 1 and number 2 have already been revealed, and we've not gotten to FlyQuest yet. That's definitely going to cause some commotion, but I think Sven has been better this year than someone like Masu, at least in terms of consistency, and that's why he's coming in above him. I don't think I'm trying to underrate other players. I think people are just undervaluing how good Sven actually is and how consistent he actually is as an AD carry. And then you've got Vulcan in the support position. This guy has reinvigorated himself. Ever since coming back to Cloud9, he has been the Vulcan of old. The old Cloud9 Vulcan has very much re-emerged. He's just one of the best playmakers in the entire region. He's been super consistent as a laner in the 2v2, constantly able to generate advantages for whoever his AD carry is, whether it was Berserker last year or Sven this year. Maybe not as much last year, but that wasn't really his fault, and I've talked about that extensively. And then this year, he's really exploded as a team fighter. He's been phenomenal in that phase of the game, and I think there were multiple games that were instantly won by Vulcan's positioning and his playmaking ability. I'm just really excited about this bot lane, and I think people are just undervaluing how good they are as a duo. I think Loki is better than people think he is. I think Sven and Vulcan are better than people think they are, and I think Thanatos is the best top laner in the league. If Blabber is your weak link, man, you're in a pretty good spot. Cloud9's in a really, really great position to take a top 2 finish. Now, that being said, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned. Blabber and Loki have to repeat that performance. And if Masu can really start stepping up and be the player that we know he can be from a mechanical perspective, you're looking at a Cloud9 team that may not be able to outpace the likes of Team Liquid or something like that. There are good teams in North America, but Cloud9 has just as good of a chance as anyone is taking that second spot. And at least for now, they were one game away from representing this region at MSI anyways, where a lot of people thought they should be in the first place. So I feel pretty good about Cloud9, and I'm just hopeful they're able to keep the form up. But that's going to bring us to our number 1 team in my power rankings, and this one should have been obvious. I don't think this was really all that contentious. It's FlyQuest coming in at number 1, especially after the MSI run. I feel pretty confident saying that until proven otherwise, this is the team to beat. It's not even really like how Team Liquid was number 1 going into the spring split, where I kind of talked about, well, TL's number 1 because they kind of need to be, but I could definitely see them getting dethroned. Right now, FlyQuest does feel like a genuinely great team. I think the fact that they're running back all 5 members from last year and they still have that cohesion has only made them better. And honestly, a lot of these players are continuing to grow and evolve, and we're looking at some of the scarier players in the West right now, full stop. And so I'm excited to go over it. Let's talk about it. Their lineup is still, of course, looking like Bwipo in the top lane, Inspired in the jungle, Quad in the mid lane, Masu at AD carry, and Busio at support. We'll just go player by player because, again, you're talking about a team full of stars here. Starting with Bwipo in the top lane. Technically, they did bring Gekgos in as another top lane option, but I believe Bwipo will still get most of the runway. They might sprinkle in, a couple of 6-man games, especially in best of 3s or, early best of 5s if they really want to try something out. But Bwipo is the starter here, and he will be until proven otherwise. Bwipo was awesome in the spring split. He's been very good domestically for Fly, for Team Liquid, for every team in North America. I honestly think it's a bit undervalued just how good Bwipo has been domestically in North America. Is he going to have bad games and bad moments every once in a while? Yes, it's Bwipo. You just kind of have to live with the fact that he's going to overextend in some pretty key situations, but really at the end of the day, the good games very much outweigh the bad, and I think he's been super valuable to what FlyQuest have been capable in accomplishing. Maybe he limits upside, I think, internationally. I think that's really the biggest criticism that you can give someone like Bwipo, because I think generally speaking, you can, if you're playing a best of 5 against one of the best teams in the world, you can kind of just mark off one game as one that Bwipo will play bad in. It's kind of just been the case over the past couple of years, but again, domestically, really not a lot of negatives. I just like Thanatos a tad bit more. And then you get to the star of this team, Inspired in the jungle. Without question, Inspired is the best player in North America, and I would go as far as to say that right now it's not even close. Inspired is the best player in the West. I don't even think there's really an argument one way or the other for any other player in Europe or in North America. I think it's just Inspired is number one in terms of the Western players. He has an argument for being like a top 5 jungler in the world, a top 15 player in the world at his absolute best. Do I think he's going to play like that all the time? Probably not. I think we saw a great version of him at MSI, and I think it really made a lot of us North American fans excited towards what he could potentially be. But as a player, he does kind of fall into his own traps a couple of times, where he just sometimes feels like he doesn't always lock in domestically, and I think there are times where I would like to see him step up and be that best player a little bit more. That's what I was talking about in the spring split a lot, where this team was putting a lot of pressure on Masu and on Bwipo to carry games, and I just don't really get why. Like, why doesn't Inspired just win games for this team? But obviously when it matters the most, this guy has stepped up and he's done everything for the team that he needs to. Even as a facilitator, he's really grown a lot in that role. And at this point, you're looking at an A+ caliber player coming out in the jungle, the best player in North America and in the Western Hemisphere. You have Quad in the mid lane. Quad's coming off of a kind of the opposite for Inspired here, where Inspired had such a good split and was so great at MSI that a lot of people are just like, well, give this guy the crown right now. And for Quad, it's kind of, it's the other direction. This guy was okay in spring, pretty good, all things considered in spring, and he was horrible at MSI, like genuinely one of the worst players at the entire tournament. I think that that's fair to say. I know I'm a bit harsher personally on Quad. I always have been on this channel, even going back to his time in the LCK, but like I just don't really see a lot of consistent upside there. Even outside of the Zillion pick, this guy was one of the weakest like Annie players at the entirety of MSI. He was constantly running it down on that champion. He was way too far forward, often not really with the rest of his team. You just have to hope that gets fixed. Right now he's still coming in as the number 2 mid laner. I don't think he's as good as Quid. Like, I think mechanically speaking, Quid is just better, and I think he makes better decisions. But I do think that Quad is, still right up there in terms of mid laners in North America. If Loki or APA can take that next leap, hell, even Saint, if like one of those players can really elevate their team and really take that next leap, maybe they could take that number 2 spot from Quad. It's not safe in his hands by any means, but if he's your weak link, I think that's pretty darn good, because the bot lane is certainly not a weak link, regardless of how I end up ranking them within their position. People are going to get pretty upset, I think, by the Masu at number 3. In fact, I'm sure there already are a couple of comments down there that are talking about how it's ridiculous that I put Masu at number 3, but I'm just going to be honest with like what I saw. I need this guy to realize how good he is at some point. Like at some point, this guy has to have a killer instinct. It has to click for him that he can take over games, because the reality of what he is right now is you have this like, this, I guess, line in terms of where all the top tier 80 carries are in North America, and you have aggressive early game and aggressive late game on the two sides of that line. All the way on the aggressive early game side, it's LYON. All the way on the aggressive late game side, it's Masu, and in the middle, it's Sven. And that's like your top 3 right now. Masu needs to learn that he can win in the early game, that this guy is good enough to be able to generate advantages. 2v2 has always been a weakness for Masu, at least at the tier 1 level, and I really just want to see him start to grow and evolve in that stage of the game. It's all well and good to be such a good team fighter and to be so phenomenal at positioning and fighting on the edge of danger and really understanding the limits of champions like Senna and like Kai'Sa at a really high level, but if you can't constantly generate large leads for yourself, it's hard for me to call you the best AD carry in your region, and that's, in my opinion, with the best support support in North America right now, a player that I gave my MVP vote to in Busio on the other side of this. So, you know, I love Masu, and he's got the potential to be by far the number 1 AD carry in North America. He's got that kind of upside to be the number 1 player in North America, but that killer instinct, especially early, really needs to unlock before I, like, full commit to giving him that number 1 spot. And then for Busio, everything I could have ever wanted to see out of Busio happened this past split. He has gone from a player that, honestly, I disrespected on this channel. I was like, Busio's really great. You feel good about him. He's your quintessential B+ player. Like, I didn't see him as an A caliber guy, as somebody who could be a big difference maker, but someone who could be a very solid piece for a team that wins the league. He was the MVP this past split, and he carried that into MSI. Something clicked in his brain as a playmaker throughout last split when he was playing things like Nico and Rakan and Bard, and everything really started to fall into place. He finally felt like a main character on FlyQuest, which hadn't really happened for him either on 100 Thieves or on Fly before that. So I'm just so excited to see that development come through. I know a lot of people have been very high on Busio for a long time. I honestly was a little bit lower on Busio for quite a while. Alo was the one I was really, you know, planting my flag on when those two were graduating together out of tier 2, but Busio has cemented himself, in my opinion, as the number 1 support in North America, and he kind of does everything at a really high level, and that makes me want to see Masu, you know, really step up even more, because this could be a bot lane that dominates North America, going alongside the best player in NA in the jungle. You have Whippo on the top side, who 90% of the time is going to be a huge asset here. And Quad, if he's your weak link, again, that is gigantic for a team domestically. This team should run North America, quite frankly, in terms of the talent they have at their disposal. If Cloud9, Team Liquid, if any of those teams are close, that is more of a hindrance on FlyQuest, I think, than it is a benefit to those other teams. They really are that good, and I think there's a chance they could get even better going into the second half of the year, depending on how the rest of this roster plays. I'm super high on Fly right now. I think they are a borderline top 5 or 6 team in the world. You know, I'm not guaranteeing that they're there, but I think it's possible that they're within that range, and that's really the first time I've been able to say that about a North American team in a very long time. All right, but that is going to do it for my LTA North Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have major disagreements from me, let me know down in the comment section below. I'm always curious to know where you guys end up agreeing or disagreeing. I'm sure there's going to be some talk about some positional rankings and things like that. Definitely curious to know where I'm off base from the community, because as you guys know, if you've watched, especially my North American content, I'm not one to sit here and just agree with what everybody else in the community is saying. I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions. So I'm curious to know where you guys disagree with that, but I do hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, of course, we're going to be covering every single game of the LTA North, as we always do every single week on this channel, so stick around for that. We also cover all 3 of the other major regions, so LEC, LCK, and LPL every week on this channel. We cover the NACL every single week on this channel. I've been casting for the LPL, so, you know, we've got a lot going on. You can check all that stuff down in the comment section or in the description below, but hit subscribe, hit the bell so you can be notified when all of that content goes live throughout the entirety of the summer split. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all